Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. We already have the tools and knowledge we need to make a difference to the quality of the air we breathe in our built environment. The conversations we have and how we share what we know is the key to our success. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Carl Zimmer, columnist for the New York Times, science writer, and author of a new book on the hidden history of the air we breathe called Airborne. There is a fascinating story to be told here in how we bring science to life with stories and good communication, the process of telling the history of science and the balance of building in the characters without diluting the fact, and B, to the stories of the pages within the book itself, of key figures in airborne science over the last 2 centuries and the lost decades to a critical part of public health that has come to bear so dramatically on us over and over again, from influenza to COVID. So it was my great pleasure to have Carl on to talk about all of this and more. He is a prolific science writer and author of numerous acclaimed books that explore biology, evolution, heredity, neuroscience, and the living world. And his latest book, Airborne, is a must-read for anyone interested in this part of our world. I really hope you enjoy this. Please don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Carl Zimmer. I guess I'm fundamentally fascinated how a science writer like yourself and an experienced one arrives at a point where you go, there's a book in this. That, you know, because it must be inbound amounts of information coming, and I imagine you got quite a broad spectrum of interests. At some point, you must have got to this point when you went, there's a story to tell here. How did you get there? I suppose that's the first question. What was the thing that kicked this whole thing off?
I would say that starting on books is like going down rabbit holes. And so you have to realize that you're in a rabbit hole and that it's going quite deep before, you should consider writing a book. A book is a big project. It's going to take a long time. It could take a couple years. It's going to be something that you need to be really obsessed about and fascinated by to keep going. And so in this particular case, I was on a team of science writers at the New York Times covering the pandemic. And, so we were all covering lots of different dimensions of the scientific research on a disease that never existed before. And so there was a lot to learn. And I there were a lot of surprises. And I honestly, I think the biggest surprise for me was that there was such a big argument over how COVID spread. I naively assumed that would be one of the easier things for scientists to understand and to work out. And instead, there was just constant battling, debates, sometimes literal screaming matches. And it took a very long time for official public health organizations to explicitly say, yes, COVID is airborne. And I just thought, this is really strange. I don't understand this. I'd like to understand it better. And so I started to talk to some of the scientists who had, led the charge to explore whether COVID is airborne. And they said, well, what you got to understand is that this did not start in 2020 with the COVID pandemic. There's a long history here. So you need to get to know people like William and Mildred Wells. And I said, who? And so that led me down this road into history, which just got more and more interesting the more I explored it. And so eventually it sort of my little book sensors went off, and I said, I think this is my next book.
That's really interesting. So do you have any number of these kind of rabbit holes you're scratching around at any one time, and it reaches a kind of a threshold, does it eventually, where you're in as far as your feet and you're going, I think there's a book here somehow? Yeah.
I'm always open to the possibility of a book, but I'm not one of those people who like always has the next book going or has 3 or 4 books going. I mean, I know people like that and they're amazing, but right now, for example, I don't have any idea for a book. And that's fine. I mean, I will spend some time, now that this book Airborne is out, just looking around and thinking, and, I've written 15 books. So, I hope to write a few more. And, I want them to be different. What's really important to me is to move on to something, separate. And so, earlier in my career, I'd written a big book about evolution. And then I was like, okay, I want to shift. And so I started thinking about the brain, because I've been doing some articles on the brain, and I just sort of wondered, when did we develop this idea that the brain is where our thoughts are? And that let me down, another rabbit hole. And I discovered people that really hadn't been written about before, and in the 17th century in Britain. And that led to a book called Soul Made Flesh. So, there is a book 16 is out there somewhere. I don't know what it is yet.
And I suppose you did was it The World of Viruses? I can't remember the exact title.
It's called The Planet of Viruses.
Planet of Viruses, that's right. So you had some history in viruses and bacteria and that kind of potential for it. So I'm guessing there was some knowledge there already. Some of the stuff that you were looking at made some sense to you from the previous book.
Sure. So in 2020, when I first started hearing about COVID, this was in January, and there were reports that were trickling out of Wuhan, China. I didn't like what I was hearing, because I had been doing a lot of writing in the past about emergent diseases, about viruses, about parasites, about all the rest of it all. I'd written a book, A Planet of Viruses. I've written a number of articles for the New York Times and elsewhere. And, and so I would talk with, colleagues who've also written a lot about emerging diseases, and we'd say, it's a coronavirus. That's not good, because we knew that coronaviruses had already spilled over from animals twice in the previous 20 years, for SARS and MERS. And in both cases, it was extremely deadly. So, it wasn't a good feeling. And then it took a little while to sort of get to understand, like, okay, this is something that it has a lower mortality rate than SARS or MERS, but it was spreading. Clearly, it could spread easily, because, the entire city of Wuhan shut down, just in the vain hope of stopping this thing. It didn't. So by February, I was telling my friends, like, there's this, have you been hearing about this thing in China? You need to be getting ready. You need to get ready for, severe disruption.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, for those who haven't read the book Airborne, there are several parts to it, but a predominant chunk of the book is historical. Is the journey of how we got here to modern science, really. But there's also a good third of the book, I'd say, dedicated to the more recent history, certainly since kind of the Gulf War and onwards, and some of the politics that came into play around the pandemic. Was that kind of where your head started in that part? Was that what you thought you were going to be writing about, and the history kind of came to the fore? Or, as you said earlier, people were already pointing you at the very beginning and going, look, there's a long story here that goes way back. And so did you find yourself just tracking back and back and back, trying to answer that, how did we end up where we are type question?
Yeah. I mean, whenever you're writing about history, I mean, this is a challenge. Uh, how far do you go to try to answer your questions about why things are the way they are today? Um, and certainly, from the outset, like I knew that I had to do some historical research because, I was being pointed to William and Mildred Wells, who were this American husband and wife team who figured out a lot of the basics of airborne infection in the 1930s and 40s. They worked it out, and then were forgotten. And so I knew that the book was going to have to draw connections at least to them. Um, and so I did a lot of archival research to understand who they were, because there's no biographies of them. There's very little about them in terms of biography. And along the way, I just started discovering lots of other people. And really fascinating people, and people in incredible conflicts, and battling over the nature of the air, the nature of disease, all of these profound questions. And after a while, you sort of realize, like, oh well, really, you even if you limit yourself just to sort of Western thought, you should probably go back 2,500 years because for so long we were dominated by this idea of miasmas, that the air itself could be corrupted, and that would cause diseases like malaria, like plague, like influenza, and how did miasmas hold sway for so long, and then how did they suddenly collapse, and then how did that connect to our sort of rediscovery of airborne infection today? So there's just all sorts of fascinating connections the more you look.
And how do you weave in a story into all of that? Because I guess there's the scientific part of your brain that's trying to understand the understanding of the time, or how that developed over time, and put that into context. So there's the right brain side of this, but you've also got to bring a story to life somehow in these books. Otherwise, they just turn into a textbook and are just not going to capture people's imagination. That must be a real skill to do that. Do you find the story finds itself in the narrative and by stitching it together, or do you have to really go and construct that story? And when if you have to construct stories, how do you find the balance between making it engaging and accurate, certainly scientifically accurate?
Well, that's certainly, you've certainly identified, one of the main tasks in science writing. You're constantly asking yourself, like, am I getting across, crucial concepts? Am I doing it in an engaging way? But the fact is that that textbooks or scientific papers, they're both very very specialized and kind of I feel like I want to say artificial kinds of communication. There's a reason that textbooks are the way they are. There's a reason why scientific papers are the way they are. But that's not really how we talk or think. And I'm including scientists themselves. So, if I'm just writing a newspaper article for the New York Times about, some recent study, I'm not going to be sort of quoting from the paper verbatim. I will call up scientists and say, so where did the idea for this research come from? Why did you decide to go to this marsh and look for some particular life form, or where did this idea come from? And then the scientists themselves start telling you their story. Then you might call up other people who are sort of involved in the field, and they'll tell you maybe a different story. And then you have to start to understand what the real story is. But, it's all storytelling. Now the challenge writing about, so, for Airborne, I could certainly talk to people who were involved in the battles over COVID and whether it's airborne because they lived through it. They fought it. But then you have the Wellses. The Wellses, died. Mildred Wells died in 1957. William died in 1963. I'm not going to be interviewing them. Fortunately, they left behind a fair amount of documents, memos, letters, and so on in archives. And lots of other people had lots of things to say about them in their own letters and documents and so on. So, once you start sifting through these things and finding those stories written down, then you can piece them together. And, some people have more interesting lives than others. And William and Mildred Wells had very interesting lives, fortunately.
Yeah. And so did it seem a lot of the characters in the book. A lot of them being pioneers and pushing the boundaries of science. Often you don't get the funding, no matter what part of history you're in, unless you've got a good story to tell and you're known. If you're a shrinking violet in some lab in the back of some dusty university, you're never going to make it into a book, unfortunately, or be very lucky to. So I guess there were some real characters interwoven through that story.
Sure. Louis Pasteur, for example, comes to mind. This is back in 1860. He was really the first person to capture microorganisms in the air, and this was a crazy idea to people at the time. They just said, "This is too fantastic." They couldn't believe it, and so he went on these amazing journeys, up glaciers and all over the place with these flasks that he used to catch germs. But that wasn't enough. What he then did is he came back to Paris with all of his flasks and then, presented them to the Academy there, but then also put on a big public lecture, a real spectacle. I mean, a sort of a TED Talk for 1860 with, projections and turning the lights on and off and making these huge declarations. I mean, he was a real performer, and that helped. That actually, that helped to get Louis Pasteur, to become almost a secular saint in France and to be, a household name today. William and Mildred Wells were not so good at that performance, unfortunately. So I think that was part of the reason they got forgotten.
Yeah. But resurrected in many ways by Riley later on. So, I mean, most of my listeners will know the Wellses and the Rileys from the Wells-Riley method, because it was a formula that was floating around ad nauseum during the pandemic. Most of us had no idea of the history that was embedded in that Wells-Riley method. So
yeah,
and that's fascinating.
And I think it's one thing that was interesting is realizing that a lot of people actually think it's the wrong Riley, because Richard Riley, Johns Hopkins professor and a former student assistant of Wells, really it did help Wells a lot in, they ran Wells's final experiment to demonstrate that tuberculosis is airborne. I mean, and Wells died during the process, and then Riley was left to try to, carry on the spirit of Wells basically by himself in the 1960s. But it was actually his brother Ed Riley, who had retired, in the 1970s and thought back to his own experience as an assistant with William Wells and thought, let me revisit that. And there happened to be a measles outbreak in New York State near where Ed Riley lived, and he went and investigated it and developed, an equation. And then, it was really fun to find a letter that Richard Riley wrote to his brother saying, hey, now that we got your paper published, I hear that, engineers are calling this the Wells-Riley equation. So, congratulations. And Ed Riley was just very happy that his name was now connected with his mentor, William Wells. And they still are connected today, but it's not Richard Riley. So just
interesting.
Clear
yeah,
that
no,
up.
that's really interesting. Yeah, most people would assume, including myself. Do you think it will be? Well, okay. A present tense question first. Was it easier stitching together the story from a long time ago than it was trying to piece together the present day information for this book, because there was still politics at play, particularly I imagine when you were doing a lot of the research for this. So the first question is that what's the easier work in a way, the historical stuff where you're looking at archives and available information and having to interpret and do the historical stuff, versus the trying to get a meeting with somebody or trying to find documents that are current. And the second part to that question is, do you think it's going to get easier or harder as we go into the future to get these archives? Because we know there's a lot of science being rewritten at the moment or deleted. I just wonder, in 100 years' time, people looking back to write science history, is it going to be the same game? Will that, you're not going to uncover letters in the same way that you uncovered with the Wellses, are you?
Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah, I mean, the old and recent history were both challenging, but in different ways. And at first I was really nervous about what I'd gotten myself into, because I was deep into working on a book about people like William and Mildred Wells, and I'm like, well, so how am I gonna bring these people to life? I mean, yes, they published some papers, and that's fine. And William Wells published one kind of difficult to read book, and that nobody read. So what do I do? What do I do? And so there was a graduate student who had written his thesis about sort of aerobiology in general in the 20th century. And he touched on the Wellses, and he mentioned that, their work was sponsored by a philanthropy called the Commonwealth Fund. And so I looked around, and it turned out, the Commonwealth Fund has archives just a couple hours from where I live over in New York State. And so I said, do you have any William Mildred Wells stuff? And they did a little work, and they're like, yeah, we've got some stuff. So come on over, and we'll have the boxes out for you. So I got there and sat down, and they had pulled, I don't know, maybe 50 document boxes for me. I was like, oh, wow.
Oh, God. Wow.
And so, and I remember, I think it may have been the first thing I pulled out, and I put it down, and it was sort of a report by someone at this philanthropy about the Wellses. So this would have been like 1933 or something like that, saying like, should we give them money? Well, who are these people? Well, and they basically did this huge investigation of them and of their background and where they were born and how they were educated and what people thought about them and their marriage, and and it's all right there, and someone's saying, well, William Wells is a terrible teacher. This is something he cannot do, but he's quite brilliant, but very difficult. And everybody knows that Mildred Wells is actually the smarter of the two, and blah, 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 blah. And it's just all right there. And I'm like, oh, here we go.
Yeah.
And
like
that's
a historical like a historical Reddit thread. All of a sudden, it's coming across this chat about people in a letter.
But but it's on paper. It's on paper, and it's in a building. And if you fill out a form and are allowed to go to the Rockefeller Archives, you can go and see it. But when I was writing about COVID, a lot of what I was writing about was the way that our understanding and public health messaging shifted as this debate about whether COVID was airborne played out. And a lot of that was being done, in the form of, Center for Disease Control web pages or World Health Organization web pages or press conferences that are posted on YouTube or posts on Twitter. That is all very ephemeral. These pages were already disappearing or being revised and so on. So, I was making great use of the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive, and what a wonderful resource. And I just hope for future generations of historians that stays in place. It was recently hacked and was down for a while, and it was a terrifying thought, because that's being able to find web pages and also to be able to see how those web pages changed over time. That's a big part of our historical knowledge, that the COVID pandemic played out online. And so if people start deleting pages or rewriting them or so on, that history could be lost, because we're not going to have that many boxes of paper sitting around preserving what happened.
I think you're absolutely right. And it can be changed subtly. Like you say, a web page might not change that meaningfully, but the nuance of it can change, and the inferred meaning. I mean, we know that's happening right now, for example, in the States quite a bit, as organizations shift how they frame certain subjects to keep funding or whatever it is. You lose the sense of time and place ever so easily. It's so transient, that digital world.
Right. Well, right now in the United States, we are dealing with thousands of web pages on government websites disappearing. That's what we're dealing with. We are dealing with a massive crisis for future historians.
Yeah. And we'll mention way back in the show notes here. I think you can donate to them as well. I think it's a phenomenally useful organization.
It really is,
to try and capture stuff for future generations. No, so I was only considering that the other day, looking at the news coming out of the States and thinking, how difficult would it be in 100 years' time trying to look back at the story of the CDC and the language being used and so on, and the politics surrounding it? Because chances are, if it wasn't captured by somebody, it's just not going to exist. And everybody's news stream, as we know, is already fairly uniquely configured. So people's perception of what's happening is different from person to person. So it's becoming for someone like yourself, actually, that must be quite worrying as you look into the future about how we tell the stories in future about what's happening today.
Sure. A lot. There are lots of government documents, that should be archived and then should be available to public access. It's even hard to get some of those documents from that are on paper. One figure in my book is a microbiologist named Theodore Roseberry, who was involved in basically turning aerobiology into biological warfare, into creating biological weapons like anthrax bombs and so on, using the principles of people like William and Mildred Wells. And then after the war, he regretted what he had been involved in and became a real opponent of the expanding biological weapons program. It was really important in eventually getting it banned. So the FBI looked at his political activities, his dissent, as obviously showing that he was a communist subversive. And so they just started tailing him and creating a file about him. And I know that there's a file of 1,200 pages on him, But when I tried to use the Freedom of Information Act to get at it, and they said, oh, well, it'll take us 10 years to go through everything and redact any sensitive information. So I just had to shrug and go off to, more public, open sources of information like archives at the National Library of Medicine. So it's always a challenge to find all the information you want to reconstruct history. And for future generations, if all those communications are by email, and people just can, delete those emails with a tap of a button, or who knows, maybe they're on Signal, not even bothering with email and archiving it, then we've got a big problem.
I'll have you back in just a minute. I just want to borrow you briefly to talk to you about 21 Degrees, a partner of the podcast. Formerly the Green Building Store, they were founded in 1995 by 3 exceptional building professionals, and the company grew out of their frustration with the poor availability of ecological building products. And I've known them for years as the go-to company in the UK for end-to-end design-led MVHR systems. You see, your home should do far more than just provide shelter and be energy efficient. If designed correctly, it'll be a far healthier and more comfortable environment. So whether you just want to start with a single product solution or need a comprehensive range of technologies to make your home more comfortable, 21 Degrees can help. In 21 Degrees, you won't find a more trustworthy, straight-talking, passionate about what they do, and approachable group of people. I speak a lot about the performance gap on this podcast and what we can achieve if we value ventilation highly enough. 21 Degrees embodies that sentiment for me. So if you're building a home, looking to install ventilation, or need to talk to experts in the field, I can't recommend them highly enough. Links are in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net, and you can find them at 21degrees.com. That's 21degrees.com. Now, back to the podcast. Yeah, no, for sure. And then history becomes much harder to tell. And, we should say this isn't a uniquely United States problem. The molding of reality is happening on every corner of the planet at the moment. So I don't think, not to cast aspersions in one direction only, although there's clearly been a seismic shift and a step in that direction in the last few months. What I think, what's fascinating to me about your work, Carl, is this bringing science to life and telling the story of knowledge. And it seems to me that there's a lot that the academic community can learn from that, because one of the fundamental reasons I do this podcast is because I'm fortunate that I get to have these amazing conversations with the Wellses of the day, effectively. And I find their framing and stories and knowledge absolutely fascinating, but it just seems to be held within these silos and doesn't break out. And that's been the eternal struggle of science, hasn't it? Is to communicate the complex and the frontier stuff in a way that resonates with people, and can build momentum and narratives and the kind of things we need science to do so desperately at the moment. Do you see that gap? Is that something as a writer of science that you see? And how do we bridge that gap in communications, do you think, in science?
I
know that's a big question. But...
Yeah. No, it is. It is a big question, but it's an important one. And, certainly that's the kind of space that I travel in and have for over 30 years as a professional writer about science. But I also teach. So I at Yale, I teach writing to undergraduates as well as to graduate science students. And, when I'm talking to the graduate science students, I'm often, having to really zero in on some really basic principles of writing and communication. And the fact is that they really haven't gotten much training in those things before we meet each other. That tells me that the scientific community doesn't really put much value on that, because they should be having more than a couple hours with me. Like learning how to write and learning how to communicate is just, you shouldn't expect to be able to do it naturally, and you shouldn't expect to be able to do it after just a couple hours. It takes work, like lots of other skills take work. And so, certainly there's plenty of room for improvement in how scientists are trained. And that doesn't mean that everybody will become Neil deGrasse Tyson or Brian Cox or one of these, amazing scientists who can write books and deliver beautiful lectures and be on talk shows. And it's not like everybody has to be like that, but certainly, I think in the United States, a lot of scientists are really baffled that, the government support for science is evaporating in terms of massive erasure of grants. That's happening right now as we speak. And they're just wondering, like, well, why don't my fellow Americans see why this is so important and valuable and cool and all the rest? Like, so clearly they are seeing that there's a big gap in terms of communication. So there's a lot of work to do.
Do you think the institutions carry some blame there? I was only talking to someone I talk with quite regularly in one of the big London universities, and they're doing some phenomenal work in the built environment, really cutting edge, exciting stuff that means stuff, real tangible outcomes in the real world, bricks and mortar effects. And they've got virtually no communications department in this university to help tell that story. Like you say, I mean, scientists themselves and researchers, without doubt, can learn to better communicate outcomes and results and intentions and framing and stuff of their work. But also they were often within big organizations who would have communication professionals in those organizations who should be telling those stories. It seems to me much better than they do. I mean, some universities do it better than others, don't get me wrong. Not that it gets you out of jail. I mean, Harvard's one of the best organizations at telling the story. And they're one of the ones under the biggest scrutiny at the moment. So I don't think it prevents the whims of politics, but we've got to get better. Those organizations, seems to me, have got to get better at telling the story of science that's coming out of those organizations, institutions.
Right. Well, if let's say you're in a plane and it's going through a hurricane. Now, if the plane's in trouble, like, I suppose you can complain about the pilot, like, oh, the pilot must not be very good. Maybe the pilot is good or not good, but you're also flying through a hurricane, So
how did you get there? Yeah.
Well, the analogy I'm trying to make there is like a hurricane's a hurricane, and you can't just pretend that you can solve everything just with the right skill. You mentioned Harvard. Harvard has a gigantic team of public information officers. They are firing in all cylinders. They reach out to journalists like me, but they also do lots of their own stuff. They get their scientists onto podcasts. They have their own podcasts. They go on social media. They're doing everything they can think of. But they are in the United States, at least, we have a culture where a lot of people look at a place like Harvard as being just, the enemy. And so, when the government says we're going to just withhold several $billions in funding, for research on things like Alzheimer's and tuberculosis and so many other things, that doesn't necessarily connect, because we're in this environment where a substantial portion of the country has developed, just very strong emotional views on a place like Harvard, and so you can send out all the press releases you want. You're still in a hurricane.
Yeah, no, that's true. And probably in a way a bad organization to note, because it would be one of the ones in the crosshairs so much that people will have a perspective of it. But you and I both know there's a lot of very good work being done by a lot of very good people in institutions that don't have that reputation. And again, lost in the wind of comms and communications, of not being able to get those messages out well enough. And maybe that's just the challenge of science in general. It's always it can be a dry. I mean, I find air quality exciting. I'm fairly unique. Most people, it's not a dinner conversation, let's face it. So that's the challenge in science, is communicating it. And that for me is what you've done so well, is the storytelling. And storytelling is a universal way of communicating. Do you find you're able to use classic storytelling structures in science writing? Can you find the heroes and the challenge and the enemies and all of those classic kind of ideas of storytelling? And is that something you consciously lean on when you're trying to structure how you get the information out in these books?
Yeah, I mean, I studied literature in college. I do not have a scientific degree. I have learned a lot about science over the years. I've been very lucky to have scientists, walk me through things, and I've read a lot of papers and a lot of textbooks and so on. But I do feel grateful for having that grounding in understanding how stories work, the different kinds of stories that people tell, the techniques that people use to tell those stories, what you give, what you hold back, how you structure a plot. Of course, when you're doing journalism or writing history, like, you are writing stories about things that actually happened, so you cannot make stuff up. And so, you can't say like, oh, it would be great if this person was the hero. And when you dig in, you find, oh, actually, he was kind of a jerk. So, you definitely do not want to stick so closely to one of these story forms that you start distorting the truth and the real history. But that I find that just you would just end up with more interesting stories. So William and Mildred Wells, the scientists who did know about them, not many, but those who did know about William Mildred Wells, well, mostly they didn't know about Mildred at all. And also, like, for William, he just seemed like this sort of this uncomplicated hero. He was this visionary. He had this great big insight, and if his message didn't get through, it wasn't his fault. And that's not true. That's not true at all. The fact is that William was only did what he did because he was married to Mildred Wells. She was quite brilliant and kept him focused and moving ahead, and together they worked on a lot of stuff. And he was terrible at getting his point across. Just people, you read these reports and you get the feeling that people were just listening to these long wandering harangues and just wishing that they could just jump out a window. It was very difficult for him to connect with people. I think a psychologist could have a field day with him.
I was going to.
So that's the real story.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that. I mean, because sometimes real life, you couldn't make it up even if you wanted to, and the stories pop from the people, and that's always a worry for me. Is that and we see this in science, the people with the biggest charismas or the stories to tell are the ones that get heard, and sometimes there's a battle between that and the real work that's going on, and I understand that. And also sometimes people could just be assholes as well, and they put people off, and science is full of them as well. There's no doubt about it. So it's the tapestry of life, science, because it's people doing this science, and you have that it's those people that drive the innovation or pull the research monies in, or can tell the stories, or can communicate it and get it turned into regulations or standards. Like it's an expression of life in general. But I was going to ask you, with all that you've read and kind of looked at the Welleses, what is your sense of him, the man, at the end of this? Was he the reason why it stalled for so long? Was he just objectionable as an individual? Was he on the spectrum somehow and just poor at communicating? Like, do you get a feeling or a sense of the character of the man looking back?
Oh, yeah. No, you definitely get a feeling for the character of the man. And I mean, from the start, people are calling him peculiar. That's the word that keeps coming up again and again. And, I feel like, sort of early 20th century language gives the word peculiar a lot of baggage. I think that there was a lot that people were trying to convey when they say, "Oh yes, William, well, he's peculiar."
I had a peculiar great auntie. I think we that term is loaded with, but these days it would be given a name, but back then it just kind of carries this baggage, doesn't it?
Yeah. He was, so William Wells was an outsider. That's another important thing to bear in mind. He was, he had been trained at MIT. He got a bachelor's, and then he was going off and being what would be called a sanitarian. He was, basically, focused on water pollution, contaminated water, and then later, looking at how oysters could become contaminated with diseases because they were taking up water that was tainted with sewage. And he was just sort of doing this stuff, and then, lost his job in the Great Depression and was desperate to find some work. And he managed to get a very low-paying job at Harvard, just teaching a class. And it turned out he was terrible at teaching. So he's making no money. He's terrible at teaching. He's barely holding on there. And you can tell that people are kind of looking at him askance because he doesn't have a PhD and so on, and he's peculiar. And so then he and Mildred start to do this research that really is going very much against the grain. At the time, in the early 1930s, that there's just an overwhelming consensus that the air was basically harmless. That patients did not exhale germs that could make you sick. Maybe they might cough in your face. That would be the worst of it. But mostly it was due to contact or contaminated water and so on. And so, they knew that they were taking on this huge consensus, and they were doing so as outsiders. And so they were paranoid and, combative, and, were sort of defending their turf. And, that they got fired from Harvard as a result.
What fundamentally drove the outsider status? Was it purely a lack of qualifications? Was it social status in some way, or were they just contrarians in general that make? Because I know lots of contrarians in science that wouldn't be considered outsiders, and then lots of people in science that would be described on the border of kooks. That are just bananas stuff they're coming up with, but this kind of outsider term with them. Do you think was it just a lack of PhD status that made them an outsider, or was it something else?
Yeah, it was a lack of PhDs, a lack of sort of, intimacy with the sort of the way that, public health was studied at the time. And um yeah, and just just and also on top of all that, they just weren't very good at kind of, working their way through the social labyrinth. And so, people would sort of, keep their distance. And at Harvard, once they actually demonstrated that lo and behold, viruses and bacteria can float in droplets in the air for hours, and lo and behold, you can knock them out with ultraviolet light. William Wells's superior said, "Okay, well, if I want the patent on that, and I'm taking over your research, and we're going to do it all in my lab." And the Wellses got into a fight with him and said, "No, we want to be totally independent." And they didn't have any allies to back them up, and so they were out. So they ended up down in it. Fortunately, they had a few admirers down in Philadelphia who got them a place at the University of Pennsylvania. But pretty soon they were in the same dysfunctional dynamic where, the very same people who were their big patrons and supporters were having to put up with them just yelling at them and arguing with them and pushing them away. They were, their colleagues would write, I would read letters where they say the Wellses are their own worst enemies. They were certainly like taking on a big challenge and trying to get the world to recognize that yes, diseases can be airborne, but they didn't make it any easier on themselves.
No, sure, and needed a good PR person. I mean, it sounded like between the two of them, they created this vortex of trouble. Oh, and interestingly, it struck me reading back through the book there again a few weeks ago was that if it hadn't been for the depression, he probably still would have been in oysters. Like he seemed fairly happy from what you could tell from what you were writing, working away in the world of oysters. Isn't it strange?
Yeah, no, he was kind of famous because, people loved eating oysters, but you'd have these huge lethal outbreaks, where people would be dying of typhoid. And he was figuring out how to disinfect oysters. He was even figuring out how to breed them. He figured out how to breed oysters. And so he was in the newspapers as, the oyster godfather. I mean, it was an amazing thing he was doing. Yeah. And I'm sure he would have been perfectly happy doing that. But then all of a sudden the crash came and everybody was just in desperate straits. And so, yeah, his career took this amazing turn.
But he seemed to be just one of these innovators and engineers and so like a good generalist. He seemed to be able to turn his hand to almost anything, not just the theory, but the practical, as you say, developing centrifuges, which seemed to go through his career actually to later innovations for separating air, and also when it came to water treatments in the war. Like he wasn't just a theoretical person; he was a practical person, wasn't he? At the heart of it.
Yeah, and from the start, that was true. So when he was MIT, he actually invented a very early water testing kit. So you could actually be standing by a stream, scoop up the water and put it in a probe and figure out whether there was E. coli in the water, whether there was fecal contamination. He invented that as a 20-year-old. So he had this real brilliant engineering skill from the start. And in World War I, he was drafted and he joined what was called the Sanitary Corps. And so there the mission was to take this new knowledge about the germ theory of disease and water contamination and protect soldiers. And so he did that. He had a truck that he developed, and at a military camp, he would, take water from a muddy, shallow stream that was, I'm sure, contaminated with all sorts of stuff, and he would disinfect it, and he would give, clean, safe water to, thousands and thousands of soldiers there, and then actually went to the front in France and was delivering safe, clean water to them, in wartime. And unfortunately, Wells could see all around him that everybody was dying anyway, but they were dying of influenza. And this was something that you couldn't prevent by keeping water clean. Like, I think maybe the first seeds about airborne disease might have been planted, because it haunted him afterwards. His sister died in the Great Pandemic. But
and you can only imagine he must have seen the bodies piling up in work. I mean, the influenza in the war, there would have been piles of bodies as a result.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, even yes, at the camp that he was at in Maryland before he was sent over, the flu had already started there. They were building extra morgues overnight because so many people were dying. And so, yes, so that definitely haunted him. And so when he got to Harvard, I think my theory about what made him click on airborne disease is that his old teacher at MIT, William Sedgwick, had gone over to Harvard to set up their public health school, and Sedgwick did this work where he was curious about the air in the late 1800s, and he had created a very simple device he called the aerobioscope, which is basically just a sort of a vacuum jar, and you sort of pop it open and air rushes in, and then you have some medium there so that if there are bacteria in the air, maybe they can grow. And there was a picture of that device in the office that they put Wells. And, Wells writes about seeing it. And I'm pretty sure that he looked at that and he said, wait a minute, that's not very good, because if there's life in the air, it's going to be very dilute. But that's we breathe, thousands of times a day. So we are sampling huge volumes of air. And so, it's kind of like oysters in the water that are sampling lots of water because they're filtering for food. So you need to be able to get a much bigger volume of air to kind of get a sense of the risks that it poses. And so he invented this crazy centrifuge to be able to capture much, much larger volumes of air. And lo and behold, he started to find lots of things in the air, and he could use the centrifuge as a scientific instrument to test his theories about airborne infection. So it was brilliant. And he would go on to invent all sorts of other things, all sorts of devices. He was incredibly clever.
And where was the passion for UV from? Was that from Mildred Wells primarily, or from himself, do you think? Or did they both have a core interest in it?
Well, once that they were building a theory for airborne infection through these floating droplets that would carry germs in them, then immediately they started thinking like sanitarians, like people who are seeing a medium that's infected, and how do you disinfect that? And so William primarily started going systematically through things that he knew worked in water. Now some things you won't try. So like chlorine, for example. Chlorine is great for disinfecting water. You're not going to put chlorine in the air. That's chemical warfare. You're going to kill people. So no chlorine. Then he said, well, what about ozone? Because ozone can disinfect. And ozone was okay in terms of attacking these airborne germs in his experiments. It wasn't great. And then it occurred to him that, actually Gordon Fair, his boss at Harvard, had done some studies in the 1920s on ultraviolet light to disinfect water, and people knew they could disinfect surfaces too. So he was like, what about ultraviolet? Let me just try it. Let me give it a shot, because, ozone hadn't worked very well. And so he tried it, and it worked incredibly well, just like total disinfection. And so that was probably around, I guess, 1933 or 1934, if I recall correctly. And so then ultraviolet light became a real obsession for both Mildred and William, going forward, until their death, really.
Yeah. And I just couldn't help, when I was reading the book, just hearing so many echoes of conversations I'm having today with people, right across the spectrum, from very highly respected academics to industry to policymakers. And there seems to be the same questions being asked 20 years on, 50 years on, 100 years on. People questioning the potential for long-range exposure to viruses, people questioning the effectiveness of UVC and UV in buildings. Studies still being done. We're still today putting UV in classrooms to try and understand if it's effective or not. Did you find that? Do you find that fascinating? This golden thread that seems to be just repeat somehow. And I just felt, reading your book, I've been having almost identical conversations that the Welleses were having in the last century. It's bizarre to me.
It really is bizarre, and it came as a surprise to me, and I've been thinking about it a lot, and so, for example, the ultraviolet light that you mentioned, there's lots of research now on particular kinds of ultraviolet light, and that might be particularly effective and safe for, keeping indoor spaces disinfected, and yet, about 90 years ago, the Wellses were working that all out. In 1940, when they went to Philadelphia, they actually were able to install ultraviolet lamps in classrooms in a school in Philadelphia, and a measles epidemic swept through the city, like the biggest measles epidemic they had ever seen. And they were able to clearly demonstrate that the kids in those classrooms where there were ultraviolet lamps pointed up to the ceiling were like 10 times less likely to get measles. I mean, it was a really big, powerful effect. And this was not something that they kept a secret. There were lots of newspaper articles, profiles in Time magazine, all sorts of coverage, and people were really excited. They were saying, oh, wow, it turns out that these diseases are airborne, and that, these UV rays can free the air of germs, and the reporters would talk about a future in which you would just have these fixtures in public spaces, and that we would be protected, from that 1918 flu pandemic that haunted Wells and everybody else. Like, maybe there wouldn't be another one thanks to UV light. I mean, this was all public discussion, and yet it disappeared. And today, in a lot of ways, we're back into this discussion with amnesia. Like, people are saying, "What, really? That doesn't make sense to me." No, there's no evidence for this. And the fact is that for almost a century, there has been at least, basic evidence. There's still lots of research to do on these scores, but yes, it's very strange. Anybody who thinks that things that are happening now are happening for the first time need to go back and look at history, because we are repeating ourselves.
Yeah. And you said that at the very beginning when you were asking people, I guess the Lydia Morauskas and the like at the very beginning of this, they were going, you need to look back in history. Like these are discussions that we've been having for a long time. But it seems even at a more fundamental level than that, seems to be this deep rooted reluctance to accept that the air can do us harm somehow. Like, that we've kind of understood it from an air pollution perspective, although you could argue we haven't, that we still need to do far more when it comes to air quality and the impacts on our health in general, particulate matters and VOCs and so on. But there seems to be this golden thread through history, that there seems to be this deep-rooted reluctance to accept the life in the air, that, as you put it, the life we breathe, and it's odd, and I can't quite put my finger on it. And it reminds me a little bit of radon. We seem to have the same problem with radon.
Mm-hmm.
Like at some psychological level, it's like people don't want to know. With radon, we know in areas of high radon, I live in Ireland, and we've got prolific levels of radon here. You can't give a test away. You literally can't give them away. And we've had studies where buildings have been identified as having high levels of radon, residences, and people won't even take free upgrades, free remediation. It's like they just don't want to know at some kind of core level. And you wonder if there's a little bit of that with viruses and bacteria and things like that in the air, that people just rather not know. That's because my hunch is, because breathing is such an instinctive thing to do, it's something we don't have control over. There's some psychological link there that doesn't want to know about something you've got no agency over at an individual level. I often say, you can not like the taste of the water you're drinking, and I can choose to wait a couple of hours until I get home and can drink water I like the taste of. We don't get that choice with air. So you wonder if there's something that finds its way all the way up to policy and science somehow, that there's just seemed this deep-rooted reluctance to accept that there's stuff in the air that does us harm somehow. I don't know.
I think that there is certainly an issue in the sense that the air is invisible, and we just think of it as this transparent gas, and that's it. Now, if there's a wildfire and you're straining to breathe, like, then you become aware, like, oh, there can be things in the air, and this is probably like dangerous. But you don't need a wildfire to get sick if you're, in a restaurant where somebody has COVID or some other airborne disease. I mean, the air can seem perfectly fine, but it could be harboring millions of viruses. And so, yes, so there is a big, I think there is a big psychological hurdle there. But I mean, there was a psychological hurdle about water and water purification. I mean, before people really came to sort of embrace the fact, like, oh yeah, actually, like, water can have bacteria and viruses in it, and that can make you sick. We should have clean water, So we've incorporated that. We just haven't incorporated airborne infection particularly well yet, and it may be just a harder thing for people to absorb psychologically. You just rather not you'd rather not that this be true. And I think for and I think then when you go to professional groups of public health experts and infectious disease folks, they are building on their own history, a history that 100 years ago was really very emphatic that you didn't have to worry about the air. And so they sort of have a kind of a default of saying, like, well, you need to prove it to me with an overwhelmingly powerful case. I mean, the fact is that, like, people would say like, oh, influenza is, definitely spread on fomites, the little dry droplets on surfaces. And they would say that with great emphasis. And yet, there's no randomized clinical trial on fomites. No one's done that. They've just sort of assumed based on what they know about the virus and about our secretions and so on. They've just said like, oh, it stands to reason that it could spread by fomites. So why, and yet then there's a separate standard for demonstrating airborne infection. And this was true for the Wells. I think this was a problem for the Wells is that people were like, you are going to have to work hard to convince me of this. I will accept these other things, but I'm holding you to a much higher standard of evidence. And it was hard to meet that standard of evidence. We still don't have that for like influenza. We still don't know really how influenza is spread. We don't know, which is crazy.
And do you think in more recent history, I mean, you touch on it quite a bit in the book, certainly from the Second World War onwards, the military-industrial complex starts to come to bear, this ability to manipulate viruses and bacteria and other things in the air and create biological weapons and so on. A lot of that research was effectively driven into underground for decades, or certainly behind closed doors. So we lost the latter part of the last century, it seems to me, in that kind of open science on it, because it had all been taken by the military industrial complex, as it were, that saw this as a weaponizable thing. Do you think that's a fair argument that somehow a lot of that, because we certainly saw, the research and it was pulled, wasn't it? Literally in the Second World War, it all turned into weaponization, or for large parts of it, the protection against that weaponization. It took on a very different momentum for half a century.
Sure, yeah. You can. It's fascinating to see the origin of it in World War II. The United States, up until then, had not really taken biological warfare very seriously as a threat. It just didn't seem like it could do that much damage. Some horses had been, exposed to some diseases, and that was about it. But in the 1930s, William and Mildred Wells had shown how diseases can be airborne, and had, developed theories and technology to study it. And you had other people who were flying around in airplanes and finding lots of things, way high up in the air, including, fungi that could wipe out a wheat farm, or, cause potato blight and destroy a potato farm. And and I write about these people in the book, and I also write about how, in World War II, the military brought together scientists and secretly said, can we make biological weapons? And they said, you know what, we can. And what we can do is we can take all this aerobiology work and just put it behind a wall at this place called Camp Dietrich, and we'll build a big aerobiology building and we will test these things out. So instead, whereas the Wellses were trying to figure out how to protect children from measles, the military was saying, how can we build weapons that will act like airborne diseases on an incredible scale and to wipe out, battalions on the battlefield?
Or even food supply chains, like you say, yes. Rust and potato blights. It wasn't just even directed at humans. Like, can we disrupt an entire population's food supply? With these weapons? Amazing.
Yeah. And some of these aerobiologists, were thinking even further. They said, okay, well, Japan is, has, lots of military vehicles. They have wheels. The wheels have tires. The tires are made of rubber. Where's the rubber coming from? It's coming from these plantations in Southeast Asia. So here is, a fungus or some other pathogen that you can send through the air to wipe out the rubber plantations, and suddenly they're not going to have tires for their armies. So this was all being experimented on, and then after World War II, it didn't stop. It just kept, it actually ramped up in the United States to incredible levels, just creating vast arsenals of, those rust spores that you mentioned, of anthrax, of tularemia, all sorts of things. And they were doing tests, and not with these particular pathogens, but sort of stand-in bacteria, in spraying them into San Francisco from offshore, or spraying them in the New York City subways, and so on. So it was a very active field, and it was all primarily classified. And so Soviet Union was doing even more. And so you have so much energy and work going into aerobiology, but it is all classified. It is all secret. All those insights, that might actually help us to understand diseases, were just hidden. And so I do think that it was a real, aerobiology, I sort of came to feel like it's been kind of a cursed science. It's really struggled to get off the ground and really come into its own. And I think the biological warfare episode was one of the biggest curses it had.
And I think you reflect that in your book. I can't remember the individual you were talking about, but they came out of that period with a lot of insight and really struggled to present that insight in a way that wasn't going to be redacted, even with the blessing of the government of the time. They were limited in what they could say, because of Official Secrets Acts.
This is Theodore Roseberry. He was a microbiologist at Columbia who ended up, in charge of a lot of the aerobiology biological weapons programs at Camp Detrick, and then came out and within a couple of years was starting to think, oh, this is not good. This is, we are in this sort of endless war, with nuclear weapons and biological weapons on a bigger and bigger scale. And he wanted to warn the public, but he knew that if he started sharing classified information, he would end up in jail. So he danced this very delicate dance to pull the scraps of public information and to sort of tell a story, to tell the story of this danger. And so he became really the most prominent speaker about biological weapons, who actually had worked on biological weapons. Everybody else was too scared to talk.
Was there a part of this book that kind of wrote itself for you? I mean, what was the most enjoyable part of this? Were there individuals or stories that just seemed to pop for you, and you really enjoyed bringing to life?
I'd say, one of the most fun parts was discovering the work of a plant pathologist named Fred Meyer. Fred Meyer, who died in 1938, he actually coined the word aerobiology. He was arguably the first aerobiologist. And he just had a tremendous amount of fun looking for life in the sky. He would fly around in airplanes or in dirigibles, in the 30s. And then he would find out about amazing voyages other people were taking, like Charles and Anne Lindbergh or Amelia Earhart. And then there was this amazing set of voyages that people took up into the stratosphere, and he would give them probes to look for life up there. And it was all just incredible and remarkable. And, it's really interesting, how just him establishing that, life can indeed survive in the stratosphere just blew people's minds. And you can see how the world started to think like, whoa, wait, so how high can life go? Could life go into outer space and to other planets? Like what? You can tell people are just starting to think about these things in the 1930s. And that was a lot of fun, especially when you then pair that with what aerobiologists are doing today in terms of really documenting the life in the air, what they call the aerobiome. now they have really, really sophisticated samplers, and they can, sequence the DNA or the RNA of things that are, in a cloud. And so they can drill down into the real diversity of the life that is all around us and that we breathe all the time. So yeah, that was a really enjoyable part.
Yeah, these were parachuting scientists on balloons that were collapsing as they were coming down from the stratosphere, and like you couldn't make it up. That was a very fun part of the book, and how did you uncover that this stuff was going on the planes? I can't remember the two people now that traveled around the world on their planes, and he was sneaking air quality. He was sneaking vials, skyhooks onto their planes, and they went missing, and he was blamed for accidents, and they went up in balloons. So phenomenal guy. Now there's a guy that got funding and managed to convince people for his ventures. So I'm guessing he was a great communicator that got people bought into what he was doing.
Yes. So Fred Meyer, he was a real charmer. You can tell that he just knew how to talk people into working with him, and so somehow he managed to reach out to Charles and Ann Lindbergh, who at the time were the most famous people in the world. They would get tens of thousands of letters a year just from anybody. Somehow he was able to reach out to them and persuade them to help design an instrument that they could bolt to the plane and take with them when they flew over Greenland to Europe, over the North Atlantic. When Meyer then, wrote up the results, he shared it with newspapers and so on. So there was a huge amount of news, it was, it was not a secret. I mean, here's someone, Fred Meyer, who we've never heard of, and yet, like in the 1930s, he was doing incredible things and was making a real sensation. And the irony is that for years his bosses at the U.S. Department of Agriculture said, you have to do this in your off hours. This is crazy stuff, and we're not supporting this at all. But eventually, like once he was able to get the Lindberghs involved and find life in the stratosphere, he was able to persuade them to say, okay, we'll support you. And not only did they support him, Meyer set up a whole government research center for aerobiology in 1937. This would have been kind of like the National Weather Service, but for life. The plans were incredibly amazing, and unfortunately, Fred Meyer died tragically looking for life in the air not long after that, and the whole thing fell apart. So again, This is part of the curse of aerobiology.
Yeah, and what's your sense of the recent history? What along with your book, but in years to come, what do you think will be the story of the pandemic and some of the instances before that, and interactions with the likes of the WHO and the CDC and the politics that surrounded it all? Like, can you kind of project in your mind's eye out that far? I mean, I know you've covered it, but it's so recent. I mean, because I imagine when you were doing the research, we were still had a hangover really from COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of project out 20 or 50 years, like having written what you've written about the last century? What's your kind of thoughts on how we'll look at how we dealt with this and whether we learned the lessons? And do you still think it's a cursed science?
I have to say that, in the 5 years since the COVID pandemic started, on the one hand, we did have this growing understanding that COVID is airborne, and that, to deal with an airborne disease, you have to take some steps that you wouldn't for a disease that spread a different way. So in that sense, these concepts of the Wells and others have really started to take hold, but then the question is, okay, well, what do you actually do to keep people safe? How do you protect people from the diseases today that are airborne, and how do you prepare for the next pandemic, which might very well be airborne? It seems like being airborne makes things very good as pandemics, I sort of feel like my view is that the momentum is going away, and that that push is slowing down. I'm not aware of any countries that now actually have real mandates with teeth for indoor air quality standards to deal with reducing infection. There are, scientists are putting out, suggestions like here's what you might do, but it's really, it's on a case by case, building by building, school by school basis. That we don't do that with water. We don't, you don't go and buy a house and say like, oh, by the way, do you do anything to make sure you don't get cholera or typhoid in your water? You don't say that, because it's like, your city ought to be taking care of the water. That's an expectation we have. That doesn't always happen, but when it doesn't happen, it's an outrage. Yeah, and so and also in just there's lots of research left to do. With UV light, for example, like there are lots of questions about how well UV light can work. And are there dangers to it? Are there side effects of just creating air pollution by having UV going all the time in poorly ventilated spaces? Those are important questions, and there should be a lot of research to address those, to address a technology that we've known can work for 90 years, and yet still it's fairly small groups that are doing the research on that. The research on influenza, still just a few small groups who don't have a lot of funding. So I think honestly, I'm not that optimistic about where we'll be in 50 years. I can very much see us going into another one of these cycles.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, and now it's even worse than the UVC. I mean, we still don't really have proper filter standards in Europe, for example, so that you can understand the category of air cleaner that you're getting if you want it, if that was your choice of de-risking a space, and never mind UV. And like you say, there's good work coming. I've got some people coming on the podcast shortly that have got some really fascinating work on far UVC, and its impacts look like really positive. But I think this microbiome question, it seems to me to be a little analogous to sustainability. It's such a nuanced and complex area that the science is never going to finish on it. So if you're looking for a black and white, this is the answer type scenario, probably doesn't exist. We don't know what a good level of bacteria and viruses is in a space. I think everybody accepts that having completely sanitized spaces is not good for anybody. So at some point, there's a line somewhere that exists where there's a healthy environment where you're exposed to enough to keep your body in check, but at the same time not dangerous. And so it's a hard one to answer. And I get that when most people I speak to are quite conflicted in this post-pandemic period. We're just not sure what the trajectory is post it. There's definitely been a step in awareness. And I think that the pandemic for the first time taught everybody that there can be acute impacts of air quality on you. But I don't know that it's been enough. That's the trouble. It's a hard one. What do you hope people get out of this book, reading it, because it's fantastic, by the way. I mean, it was an absolute... I listened to it both an audio book, which I can thoroughly recommend. The narrator of that was excellent. And the book itself, I have to say, though, it's a twice read book. There's no doubt about it. You find yourself, anybody that's watching this on camera can see copious notes and marks in it. It's one of those books, not just because I knew I was talking to you, but because you're going, I need to go back to that bit. That's brilliant. What's your hope for the book that people get out of this book?
I hope that they look back on the COVID pandemic that they lived through and think about it differently. I think that there was a story about COVID that I think a lot of people didn't really appreciate was playing out all around them, and that was part of a big, deep, fascinating, messy history. I would also hope that people would just look up into the sky and think about it differently, to recognize that it is just teeming with life, that the atmosphere is an ecosystem, and some of it you can see. Maybe you see a dragonfly shooting past you or a hummingbird, but as you look up in the sky, the life just keeps going up and up and up. And you're a part of it. Your lungs are part of the atmosphere. And that joins you. And it can be a little scary when you think about the things that you can breathe in that can give you tuberculosis or all sorts of terrible things. But it's also enthralling that we are a part of this remarkable space that we call the air.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Carl, thanks so much for spending the time talking to me this afternoon. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I can't rate your book highly enough, particularly for geeks and nerds like myself that are into this space. But there's a broader story in this, and I think anybody that's got any interest in the air that we breathe will have an interest in this book. So I can't recommend it highly enough, and we'll certainly put it in the show notes. Carl, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? If you enjoyed the podcast and know somebody else who might be interested, do spread the word and let's keep building this community. This podcast was brought to you in partnership with Erico, ACO, Ultra Protect, Imbiot and 21 Degrees, all great companies who share the vision of the podcast and aren't here by accident. Your support of them helps them support this show. Do check them out in the links and in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. And don't forget to check out the YouTube channel by the same name, with plenty more content due to come on that channel. Thanks very much. See you next week.